Ammas Lake is a jewel in the spectacular scenery that makes up northern British Columbia. It's part of traditional territory for the Takla, Sekani, and Quadacha First Nations. It was also the site of the proposed Ammas North Mine, a project initiated by Northgate Minerals.
The company proposed to dam the lake and raise the lake level and fill it with the tailings pond. And over the course of the mine, it would eventually leach into the Finley River, which supplies two of the community's drinking water. So it's an issue of long-term acid drainage problems as well as water quality problems.
J.P. LaPlante is the mining coordinator for Takla First Nation, one of Carrier Sekani's member nations.
Here's the Ammas South mine site, and here's Ammas Lake.
It was his responsibility to assess the mining company's plan to dump 750 million tons of acid rock tailings into the lake. According to Carrier Sekani's values and traditions, the proposed mine would do too much environmental damage for the First Nations involved to support it.
It became clear right from day one when the company proposed to kill Ammas Lake was that the Sekani view water as being sacred, and keeping it clean and maintaining it for future generations is an obligation that the Sekani members have. So water being sacred, and Ammas is especially sacred because it's a headwater, and therefore supplies the drinking water for not just the communities but for all the wildlife and animals downstream.
Despite the threats, gaining support within the communities was a lengthy process that lasted over 5 years. But it began when protests were organized, funding for reviews was scraped together, and CSTC First Nations made their voices heard through the environmental review process.
That means stepping over First Nations. I think that's what he's saying.
While they were attending in protest, there were testimonies made and presentations made to the joint review panel. That was comprised of 3 members who were deliberating and making recommendations to the government. So after it was decided to participate in protest, community members and technical staff and the political leaders did attend the hearings to make presentations and to convince the panel that this was a bad idea. So I guess the analogy would be that you can't keep throwing stones over the wall. You have to go in and convince people diplomatically that this wasn't right.
Having the ability to conduct independent research when faced with new environmental threats is an important aspect of successful environmental governance. It allows First Nations to identify and define the environmental issues from their own perspectives, and then use this information to make decisions that will benefit their people. Despite having a shoestring budget, the Carrier Sekani Nations did their own research and discovered important information that they used to protect their lands.
Northgate Minerals had hired a company from Vancouver to do the archaeology research, and did not consult with the Sekani about how to interpret the findings as well as the quantity of archaeology sites found. And the Sekani disagreed completely with the assertions made by Northgate Minerals that this was a lake not used very often. For that reason, they, out of their own band funds, had to hire archaeologists to go up to Ammas, and in a very short amount of time, because they couldn't afford a large research project, the independent archaeologists found a large, 8 additional sites, including a potential grave site. And that just goes to show how better the research could be if it is done in collaboration with the Aboriginal communities.
The nature of the Ammas mines, for example, would warrant a diversion of funding from programs to deal with an issue like Ammas. So it is it's not an easy decision for council to balance, and at some point in time you have to make some sacrifices, and I think that's what the Takla Band and the Sekani Nations did.
Being recognized as an authority by other governments is an element of successful First Nation environmental governance. This is an ongoing challenge, to be heard and included as decision makers in the environmental assessment and review processes.
The First Nation communities asked to be full partners in the environmental assessment and were refused. And so it was very difficult for them to enter the process simply as stakeholders. And there's no legislated role for First Nations in the EA process in BC. For that reason, they participated in protest. And it's for that reason that they continue to demand that future environmental assessments include them as full partners.
In the spring of 2008, it was announced by the federal government the proposed Camas North mine would not go ahead. Ammas Lake was ultimately spared thanks to the persistence of the protesting First Nations and their decision to use their time and resources to protect their lands and waters, cultures and traditions.
First Nations have real authority over the land and real knowledge about the land that decision makers in Ottawa and elsewhere don't have. For that reason, they shouldn't second guess themselves, and when something's wrong, they should have faith in their community that they can say no.
Rescuing Ammas Lake was a great victory for the Sekani First Nations and the Carrier Sekani Tribal Council. It established that united communities applying the elements of successful environmental governance can achieve unqualified success. This process would also be applied to address threats from oil and gas pipeline developments.